Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Rider on the Pale Horse by Helen Eustis. Mr. Death come a riding in from the plains on his pale stallion, a shooting off his pistols, bangety bang bang, till you'd have thought some Injun was on a spree. Hooey! We was scared, all us little uns, and the grown folks too. Only to them he seemed more familiar. But he never touched nary a soul that day but Billy B. Damn Bangtree, the one the girls was all crazy for. And Mr. Death, no one just laid a finger on him, so he didn't die right off, but lay there cold and sweating, dying of a bullet in his belly, which was shot off by a drunken cowpoke in a wild euchre game. Now many girl in our town wet the pillows with her tears when she heard how young Billy was like to die, for he was a handsome man and drove all women wild. But the one that cried and carried on the worst was pretty little Maud Applegate, with the freckles and the red hair. Old Injun Mary was a nursing Billy with poultices and healing herbs, and wouldn't let no other woman near his door, so there wasn't nary a thing Maud Applegate could do for him. But you can't expect a red-headed woman to just sit around and fret like you would another girl, and Maud was no exception to that rule. Though she cried and carried on for a while, she pretty soon decided something had to be done. So she dried her eyes on her pettiskirt, saddled up her daddy's pinto pony, and took out across the plains after Mr. Death. Maud Applegate, she rode high and she rode low. She rode through the cow country into the sheep country, through the sheep country into the Injun country, through the Injun country to the far mountains, and there at last she caught up with Mr. Death, just about a mile down the trail from the little old shack where he lived, with his granny up above the timberline. When Maud Applegate spied his pale stallion, she was mighty tired and mighty weary. Her red hair was all tumbled down her back, and her daddy's pinto wasn't no more'n skin and bone. But she caught up her breath and sang out loud, "Oh, wait up, Mr. Death, wait up for me." Mr. Death, he pulled up his pale stallion and looked around surprised like, for there isn't many that call out to halt him. "Why, what you want, missy?" he asked Maud Applegate as she rode up alongside. "Jumpin' Jehoshaphat, if you don't look like you rode clean through the briar patch." "Oh, Mr. Death," Maud panted out, "I rode high and I rode low after you. I rode through cow country into sheep country, through sheep country into Injun country, through Injun country to the far mountains, and all to ask you, would you spare Billy B. Damn Bangtree, my own true love?" At that, Mr. Death threw back his head, so his black sombrero slipped off and hung round his neck by the strings, and he laughed loud. "Now ain't that cute?" said Mr. Death. "Honey, I reckon you're just about the cutest thing I'm likely to see." But Maud Applegate, she rode high and she rode low. She'd stood thirst and she stood hunger. She liked to kill her daddy's pretty little pinto. Furthermore, she was a red-headed woman, and she wasn't going to be laughed at, so she took and cussed out Mr. Death good. She told him where she come from no gentleman laughed at no lady in her true trouble, and she thanked him to mind his manners with her, and she'd like to know who brought him up, anyhow. Why, she knew bucks that acted better'n him. She lay his mammy a spinning in her grave, and so on. While Mr. Death, he sobered down shortly, and sat up straight in his saddle and listened real still, with only his eyes a-blinking. When Maud gave out of breath, he took out his baccy bag, licked the paper, and rolled him a smoke. "What do you give me for Billy D. Dan Bangtree?" said he. But Maud Applegate, she was really wound up. She tossed her hair like a pony's mane and made a sassy mouth. "I ain't a-gonna talk business until I've washed my face and had me a bite to eat. And I've rode high and I've rode low." All right," said Mr. Death. "Ride along now, and I'll take you to my cabin where my old granny will take care of you." So Maud and Mr. Death, they rode up the slope, Mr. Death reining in his pale stallion to keep down to the poor tired pinto, until presently they came to a little old shack with smoke coming out of the stovepipe. There was Mr. Death's granny standing in the door as pleased as Punch to see some company. "Why, you're right welcome, missy," she sang out. "Soon's they're calling distance. The pot's on the stove and the kettle's a boiling, and come right in and rest yourself a while." So they pulled up, and Mr. Death swung down off his pale stallion, come round by Maud, and lifted her right down to the ground, with his two big hands a meeting around her little waist. "Ah, ain't she the pretty little thing?" his granny kept saying all the while, and hobbling around the dooryard on her crutch like a bird with a broken wing. Then she takes Maud inside and gave her warm water and an ivory comb and a pretty white silk wrapper from out of her old brass-bound chest. And when Mr. Death come in from seeing to the hosses, there's Maud Applegate a-settin' like a red-headed angel drinking tea. Maud, she perked up soon as she got some victuals inside her, and presently she had Mr. Death and his granny laughing fit to bust with her comical tales of the folks back home. Soon Mr. Death, he set into yawning and gaping. "I've rode a far piece today," he said to his granny. "I've been twice around the world and back, and I think I'll lay my head in your lap and catch 40 winks." And shortly he was a-snoring. Then Death's granny began to talk low to Maud Applegate, questioning her all about herself, and where she come from and why she come. So Maud told her all about Billy B. Dan Bantry. Her own true love lay a-dying of a bullet in his belly, so what could she do but take out after Mr. Death to beg him to stay his hand. When Death's granny had heard the whole story, she fetched a great sigh. "Well," she said, "it's a great pity to me you got your heart set, for you're like the girl I once was. And if I had my way, you're the girl I'd choose for my grandson to marry, for I'm old and tired, and would like to see him settled before I go to my rest. You're young, and you're pretty, and you don't stand for no sass, and if my eyes don't deceive me, you can do a bit of witching too. Now, ain't that true?" "Well," Maud answered her modestly, "just a little of the plain." "Like what now?" said Death's granny. "White or black?" "Little of both," said Maud. "Witched my little brother into passing his arithmetic, and I also witched the preacher's wife so she tripped on a shoestring and fell in the horse's trough." Once more Death's granny fetched a sigh. "That's a good start for a young un," said she. "Don't look to me like a girl like you ought to waste yourself on no drunken gambling cowhand gets himself shot up in some fool card game. Howsomever, if you got your heart set, I'll help you. Whenever Death catnaps this way, he shortly begins to talk in his sleep, and when he talks, he'll answer 3 questions truly, and then wake up. What shall I ask him for you?" "Ask him," said Maud right away, "what is his price to let off Billy B. Dan Bantry?" "That's one," said Death's granny. "You got 3 questions. What else?" At this, Maud had to think, and presently she said, "Ask him why he took my baby's sister from her cradle." "Very well, child," said granny, "and one more." Then Maud Applegate bent her red head near to the red fire, and was still, but at last she said kind of low and slow, "Ask him what he does when he's lonesome." To this, Death's granny answered nothing at all, and so they sat in quiet until shortly Death began to mumble in his sleep. Then his granny took a hold of a lock of his coal-black hair and tweaked it gentle-like. "Yes," Death said, but without waking up. "Yes?" "Tell me, son," Death's granny said, bending over his ear, "what will you take to let Billy be Dan Bantry?" At this, Death twitched and turned in his sleep. "Oh, granny," he said, "she's such a pretty girl. If it was some, I'd make it an eye, and if it was others, I'd make it 10 years of life. But for her, I'll make it that she must ride with me 2 times around the world and give me a kiss on the lips." At this, Maud drawed a great deep breath and leaned back in her chair. "Well, son," said granny, "here's another question she asks of you. Why did you take your baby sister from the cradle?" Then Death twisted and turned in his sleep again. "She was sick," he said. "She was full of pain. I took her so she need never cry no more." At this, Maud bowed her head and hid her cheek in her hand. "Well, son," said Death's granny, "and here's the last one. What is it you do when you're lonesome?" At Death gave a regular heave in a great groan, and turned his face from the light of the fire. For a long time he whispered and mumbled, and finally he said real low, "I peeped through the windows at how the humans be in sleep in each other's arms." And with this last, he woke up with a jerk, gave a mighty yawn, saying, "My stars, I must have dropped off." Now Mr. Death and his granny was cheerful folks in spite of his profession, and that evening they gave Maud Applegate such a high old time that she was almost glad she'd come. Death's granny, she told some mighty edifying stories about her young days, and furthermore she got out her jug of her blackberry wine. And Death, he played such merry tunes on his fiddle that Maud Applegate got right out of her chair, picked up her skirts, and danced. It was late that night when Death's granny showed Maud to a little trundle bed all made up fresh beside her own four-poster. In the morning, Death's granny had Maud's own dress all mended and pressed for her, and a fine breakfast of coffee and ham and grits to stay their stomach for their long trip. And when Mr. Death brought round his pale stallion all saddled and bridled to go, the tears were standing in his granny's eyes as she kissed Maud Applegate good-bye. "Good-bye," Maud said. "I thank you for your fine hospitality, and if it wasn't for Billy B. Dan Bantry, my own true love, I'd be right sorry to go." Mr. Death, he lifted Maud up to his big stallion and leaped astride. Then away they rode right up the snowy mountain top into the sky. And Maud Applegate was surprised to find herself warm and comfortable, right in pillion with her arms wrapped around Mr. Death's waist. Then didn't they have a ride? Mr. Death, he rode his pale stallion up the mountains of the storm to the pastures of the sky where the little clouds was grazing beside their big fat white mammies, and the big black daddy clouds kept watch around the edge. And he rode right up in the fields where the stars grow, and let Maud Applegate pluck a few to wear in her red hair. He rode past the moon, and when Maud Applegate reached out and touched it, it was cold as snow and slippery too. They couldn't go too near the sun, Mr. Death said, lest they might get burned. But Mr. Death, he had his business to tend to, so pretty soon they set out across the wide ocean on their way to twice around the world. Mr. Death, he wrapped Maud in his cloak of invisibility and took her to all sorts of houses and all sorts of climes. Houses where Chinese folk lived, and Russian and Japanese and African, and folks that never spoke a word of English since the day they were born. He showed her castles and dirty little huts, the like of which she'd never seen in all the state of Texas. He showed her kings and princes and poor folks and all, and maybe she didn't just open her eyes, but in one respect she noticed they was all alike. When Mr. Death come, the living couldn't see him and wept and wailed, but the folks that was dying rose up to greet him and smiled at him on their way, like they knew him for a friend. She was right glad to see that everybody didn't take him for such a bad fellow after all. While they rode, Mr. Death, he told Maud Applegate many a pretty tale about his far travels, and it was plain to see he was a man knew more than liquor and women and ride and herd. And when they was on their last lap round, and on their way home, Mr. Death, he rode out over the ocean and showed Maud Applegate where the whales played. She saw him just as plain, a-plowing through the clear green water like a herd of buffalo on a grassy plain. And he rode over the North Pole for her to see the polar bears, which was all white but for their noses. And he showed her the crocodiles of Egypt drifting down the Nile, and the tigers of India too, and every strange creature with his mate. And at last Maud Applegate couldn't help feeling sorry for Mr. Death, that he was the only one who had to be alone in all the whole wide world. But at last they was loping back over the plain toward our town. They seen the smoke arising from the stovepipes and chimneys into the pale blue sky. They rode right down the main street past Tarbell's Emporium, past the Wells Fargo office, and reined up before the Bluebird Saloon. "Why, what you pulling up here for?" Maud Applegate asked of Mr. Death, feeling surprised, but Mr. Death only answered, "Never mind, you'll see," and swung down out of the saddle. Then he reached up and lifted Maud down from off his pale stallion, and he wrapped her once more in his cloak of invisibility, and he said to her, "Now for the rest of the bargain." So Maud stood there with her eyes shut, kind of stiff and feeling herself for his kiss, but nothing happened at all. So she opened them again, and Mr. Death said to her, "No, Maud, the bargain was that you was to kiss me." So Maud, she was obliged to. asked Mr. Death to lean down her head, which he did, and she was obliged to reach up and put her mouth on his. Now maybe she thought it would be cold, and maybe she thought it would be fearful to kiss Mr. Death. I don't know. I'm sure, but it surely come as a great surprise to her when she found her two arms around his neck without her knowing how they got there, and her own two lips on his. And the truth of the matter is, it was Mr. Death stepped away the first and told her soft and low, "Run along now, Maud. Billy be damned Bantry. Your own true love is getting right in there in the Bluebird Stout Saloon." Then Mr. Death unwrapped her from his cloak of invisibility so she couldn't see him no more, only hear his spurs jingling as he walked away. And Maud Applegate was left standing by herself before the Bluebird Saloon, where inside the window she could see Billy be damned Bantry, her own true love, sitting at a table drinking whiskey with a bunch of fly young women of a kind doesn't mind sitting in saloons. Oh, then, Maud Applegate's bosom was so full of 1,000 feelings she thought she would bust, and she didn't know whether what she wanted most was to wrench up the hitchin rail, bust into the Bluebird Saloon and lambaste her own true love, or whether she'd simply like to melt of shame and sink through the ground. Then she noticed that her daddy's pinto, all groomed and saddled, was tied up by the Bluebird door. She was just about decided to mount him and gallop off home before anybody seen her, when Billy B. Dan Bantry caught a sight of her through the window, and come pushing out the swinging door, swaggering and hitching his pants, like he'd never been half dead in his life. "Why," he sings out, "if it ain't little Maud Applegate waiting for me outside the Bluebird Saloon. Where you been, honey? Heard you was away." Maud Applegate. She felt the red coming up in her face. She snapped back at him. "Heard you was mighty sick." "Mighty sick," Billy said, shaking his head. "Mighty sick and like to die. But old Injun Mary, she doctored me good as new with her poultices and herbs." Now, this was the last straw to Maud Applegate. She'd rode high and she rode low. She'd rode through cow country to sheep country, through sheep country to Injun country, through Injun country to the far mountains, all to stay the hand of Mr. Death from taking Billy B. Dan Bantry, her own true love. She'd rode twice around the world and back, and gave a kiss on the lips to a strange man, and all to save a feller which turned out to be this horse-smelling, whiskey-breathing, tobacco-chewing, loose-living, gambling, no-good cowhand standing here looking at her like she was a ripe peach, and all he had to do was shake the tree. Maud Applegate was so mad she could have cried, but she didn't do no such thing, since she was a red-headed woman, and besides, something better came to her mind. Just then she seen old Pap Tarbell leaning out the upstairs window of Tarbell's Emporium, and Maud she took and witched a spell. When Pap let fly with his tobacco juice, Maud she witched it straight into Billy B. Damned Bantry's eye, and while he was still standing there a-cursing and a-swearing in such language as no lady cares to hear, Maud unhitched her daddy's little pinto pony and leaped astride. She dug in her heels and set the dust a-flying as she galloped down the street out of town. She rode through cow country into sheep country, through sheep country into Injun country, through Injun country to the far mountains until she caught sight of Mr. Death on his pale stallion. Then she sung out, "Oh, wait up, Mr. Death, wait up for me." And when Mr. Death heard her, he turned and rode back down the trail, though he is one who turns back for no man. And he snatched her off her little pinto and onto his pale stallion. He held her close and he kissed her good, and pretty soon she said, "I guess Granny'll be mighty proud to see you." And Maud Applegate said to him, "Just don't let me hear no talk about peeping through folks' windows, never no more." Now, Maud Applegate, she lived long and happy with Mr. Death, and from all I hear, she's with him yet. Fact is, she took to helping him with his work, and when we was little uns and cross at bedtime and starting to cry, our mammies will tell us, "Hush now, honey, close your eyes, and pretty soon Maud Applegate will sit by your bed and sing you a lullaby." And she used to, too. Heard her myself. Slaughterhouse by Richard Matheson. I submit for your consideration the following manuscript, which was mailed to this office some weeks ago. It is presented with neither evidence nor judgment as to its validity. This determination is for the reader to make. Signed, Samuel D. McLeodon, Associate Secretary, Rand Society for Psychical Research. This occurred many years ago. My brother Saul and I had taken a fancy to the old tenantless slaughterhouse. Since we were boys, the yellow edge pronouncement "For Sale" had hung lopsided in the grimy front window. We had vowed with boyish ambition that when we were old enough the sign must come down. When we had attained our manhood, this aspiration somehow remained. We had a taste for the Victorian, Saul and I. His painting was akin to that roseate and buxom transcription of nature so endeared by the 19th century artists, and my writing, though far from satisfactory realization, was marked by a meticulous sweep of ornate phrase, which the modernist decries dullness and artifice. Thus, for the headquarters of our artistic labors, what better retreat than the slaughterhouse, that structure which matched in cornice and frieze our intimate partialities? None, we decided, and acted readily on that decision. The yearly endowment arranged by our deceased parents, albeit meager, we knew to suffice, since the house was in gross need of repair and, moreover, without electricity. There was also, if hardly credited by us, a rumor of ghosts. Neighborhood children quite excelled each other in relating the harrowing experiences they had undergone with various of the more imminent specters. We smiled at their clever fancies, never once losing the conviction that purchase of the house would be wholly practical and satisfactory. The real estate office bumbled with financial delight the day we took off their hands what they had long considered a lost cause, having even gone so far as to remove the house from their listings. Convenient arrangements were readily fashioned, and in a matter of hours we had moved all belongings from our uncommodious flat to our new relatively large house. Several days were then spent in the most necessary task of cleaning. This presented itself as far more difficult a project than first anticipated. Dust lay heavy throughout the house and rooms. Our energetic dusting would send clouds of it billowing expansively, filling the air with powdery ghosts of dirt. We noted in respect to that observation that many a spectral vision might thus be made explicable, if the proper time were utilized in experiment. In addition to dust on all places of lodgment, there was thick grime on glass surfaces, ranging from downstairs windows to silver-scratched mirrors in the upstairs bath. There were loose banisters to repair, door locks to recondition, yards of thick rugging out of whose mat to beat decades of dust, and a multitude of other chores, large and small, to be performed before the house could be deemed livable. Yet, even with grime and age admitted, that we had come by an obvious bargain was beyond dispute. The house was completely furnished, moreover furnished in the delightful mode of the early 1900s. Saul and I were thoroughly enchanted. Dusted, aired, scrubbed from top to bottom, the house proved indeed a fascinating purchase. The dark luxurious drapes, the patterned rugs, the graceful furniture, the yellow-keyed spinet, everything was complete to the last detail, that detail being the portrait, or rather lovely young woman which hung above the living-room mantel. When first we came upon it, Saul and I stood speechless before its artistic quality. Saul then spoke of the painter's technique, and finally, in rapt adulation, discussed with me their various possibilities as to the identity of the model. It was our final conjecture that she was the daughter or wife of the former tenant, whoever he had been, beyond having the name of Slaughter. Several weeks passed by. Initial delight was slaked off by full-time occupancy and intense creative effort. We rose at 9, had our breakfast in the dining room, then proceeded to our work. I in my sleeping chamber, Saul in the solarium, which we had been able to improvise into a small studio. Each in our places, the morning passed quietly and effectively. We lunched at 1, a small but nourishing meal, and then resumed work for the afternoon. We discontinued our labors about 4 to have tea and quiet conversation in our elegant front room. By this hour it was too late to go on with our work, since darkness would be commencing its surrounding pall on the city. We had chosen not to install electricity, both for reasons of monetary prudence and the less sordid one of pure aesthetics. We would not for the world have distorted the gentle charm of the house by the additions of blatant, sterile electric light. Indeed, we preferred the flickering silence of candlelight in which to play out nightly games of chess. We needed no usurping of our silence by noxious radio bleatings. We ate our bakery bread unsinged and found our wine quite adequately cooled from the old icebox. Saul enjoyed the sense of living in the past, and so did I. We asked no more. But then began the little things, the intangible things, the things without reason. Walking on the stairs in the hallway through the rooms, Saul or I, singly or together, would stop and receive the strangest impulse in our minds, a fleeting moment yet quite definite while existent. It is difficult to express the feelings with adequate clarity. It was as if we heard something, although there was no sound, as though we saw something when there was nothing before the eye. A sense of shifting presence, delicate and tenuous, hidden from all physical senses and yet somehow perceived. There was no explaining it. In point of fact, we never spoke of it together. It was too nebulous a feeling to discuss, incapable of being materialized into words. Restless though it made us, there was no mutual comparison of sensation, nor could there be. Even the most abstract of thought formation could not approach what we were experiencing. Sometimes I would come upon Saul casting a hurried glance over his shoulder, or reaching out to make contact with empty air as though he expected his fingers to touch some invisible entity. Sometimes he would catch me doing the same. On occasion we would smile awkwardly, both of us appreciating the moment without words. But our smiles soon faded. I almost think we were afraid to deride this unknown ages for fear that it might prove itself actual. Not that my brother or I were superstitious in the least degree. The very fact that we purchased the house without paying the slightest feasance to the old wives' tales about its supposed anathema seems to belie the suggestion that we were, in any manner, inclined towards mystic apprehensions. Yet the house did seem, beyond question, to possess some strange potency. Often, late at night, I would lie awake knowing somehow that Saul was also awake in his room, and that we were both listening and waiting, consciously certain about our expectation of some unknown arrival which was soon to be offered. And it was. Part 2. It was perhaps a month and a half after we had moved into Slaughterhouse that the first hint was shown as to the house's occupants other than ourselves. I was in the narrow kitchen, cooking supper on a small gas stove. Saul was in the dining alcove arranging the table for supper. He had spread a white cloth over the dark glossy mahogany. On it placed 2 plates with attendant silver. A candelabrum of 6 candles glowed in the center of the table, casting shadows over the snowy cloth. Saul was about to place the cups and saucers besides the plates as I turned back to the stove. I twisted the knob a trifle to lower the flame under the chops. Then, as I began to open the icebox to get the wine, I heard Saul gasp loudly, and something thumped on the dining room rug. I whirled and hurried out of the kitchen as fast as I could. One of the cups had fallen to the floor, its handle snapping off. I hurriedly picked it up, my eyes on Saul. He was standing with his back to the living room archway, his right hand pressed to his cheek, a look of speechless shock contorting his handsome features. "What is it?" I asked, placing the cup on the table. He looked at me without answering, and I noticed how slender fingers trembled on his whitening cheek. "Saul, what is it?" "A hand," he said. "A hand." It touched my cheek. I believe my mouth fell open in surprise. I, deep within the inner passages of my mind, had been expecting something like this to happen. So had Saul, yet now that it had, a natural sense of oppressive impact was on both of our shoulders. We stood there in silence. How can I express my feeling at that moment? It was as though something tangible, a tide of choking air, crept over us like some shapeless, lethargic serpent. I noticed how Saul's chest moved in convulsive leaps and depressions, and my own mouth hung open as I gasped for breath. Then, in an added moment, the breathless vacuum was gone, the mindless dread dissolved. I managed to speak, trusting to break this awesome spell with words. "Are you sure?" I asked. His slender throat contracted. He forced a smile to his lips, a smile more frightened than pleasant. "I hope not," he replied. He reinforced his smile with some effort. "Can it really be?" he went on, his joviality failing noticeably. "Can it really be that we've been duped into buying ourselves a haunted house?" I maintained an effort to join in with his spirit of artificial gusto for the sake of our own minds, but it could not last long, nor did I feel any abiding comfort in Saul's feigned composure. We were both exceptionally hypersensitive, had been ever since our births. mine some 27 years before his 25. We both felt this bodiless premonition deep in our senses. We spoke no more of it, whether from distaste or foreboding, I cannot say. Following our unenjoyable meal, we spent the remainder of the evening at pitifully conducted card games. I suggested in one unguarded moment of fear that it might be worth our consideration to have electrical outlets installed in the house. Paul scoffed at my apparent submission and seemed a little more content to retain the relative dimness of candlelight than the occurrence before dinner would have seemed to make possible in him. Notwithstanding that, I made no issue of it. We retired to our rooms, quite early, as we usually do. Before we separated, however, Saul said something quite odd to me, way of thinking. He was standing at the head of the stairs looking down. I was about to open the door to my room. "Doesn't it all seem familiar?" he asked. I turned to face him, hardly knowing what he was talking about. "Familiar?" I asked of him. "I mean," he tried to clarify, "as though we'd been here before." "No, more than just been here. Actually lived here." I looked at him with a disturbing sense of alarm gnawing at my mind. He lowered his eyes with a nervous smile, as though he said something he was just realizing he should not have said. He stepped off quickly for his room, muttering a most uncordial good night to me. I then retired to my own room, wondering about the unusual restlessness which had seemed to possess Saul throughout the evening, manifesting itself not only in his words but in his impatient card play, his fidgety pose on the chair upon which he sat, the agitated flexing of his fingers, the roving of his beautiful dark eyes about the living room, as though he were looking for something. In my room I disrobed, effected my toilet, and was soon in bed. I had lain there about an hour when I felt the house shake momentarily, and the air seemed abruptly permeated with a weird, discordant humming that made my brain throb. I pressed my hand over my ears, and then seemed to wake up, my ears still covered. The house was still. I was not at all sure that it had been a dream. It might have been a heavy truck passing the house, thus setting the dream into motion in my upset mind. I had no way of being absolutely certain. I sat up and listened. For long minutes I sat stock still on my bed and tried to hear if there were any sounds in the house. A burglar, perhaps, or Saul prowling about in his quest of a midnight snack. But there was nothing. Once, while I glanced at the window, I thought I saw out of the corner of my eye a momentary glare of bluish light shining underneath my door. But when I quickly turned my head, my eye saw only the deepest of blackness, and at length I sank back on my pillow and fell into a fitful sleep. Part 3. The next day was Sunday. Frequent wakings during the night and light, troubled sleep had exhausted me. I remained in bed until 10:30, although it was my general habit to rise promptly at 9 each day, a habit I had acquired when quite young. I dressed hastily and walked across the hall, but Saul was already up. I felt a slight vexation that he had not come in to speak to me, as he sometimes did, and not even look in to tell it was past rising time. I found him in the living room, eating breakfast from a small table he had placed in from the mantelpiece. He was sitting in a chair that faced the portrait. His head moved around quickly as I came in. He appeared nervous to me. "Good morning," he said. "Why didn't you wake me up?" I said. "You know I never sleep this late." "I thought you were tired," he said. "What difference does it all make?" I sat down across from him, feeling rather peevish as I took a warm biscuit from beneath the napkin and broke it open. "Did you notice the house shaking last night?" I asked. "No. Did it?" I made no reply to the flippant air of his counter-question. I took a bite from my biscuit and put it down. "Coffee?" he said. I nodded curtly, and he poured me a cup, apparently oblivious to my pique. I looked around the table. "Where is the sugar?" I asked. "I never use it," he answered. "You know that." "I use it," I said. "Well, you weren't up, John," he replied with an antiseptic smile. I rose abruptly and went into the kitchen. I opened up one side of the cabinet and retrieved the sugar bowl with irritable fingers. Then, as I passed it, about to leave the room, I tried to open the other side of the cabinet. It would not open. The door had been stuck quite fast since we moved in. Saul and I had decided, in a facetious keeping with neighborhood tradition, that the cabinet contained shelf upon shelf of dehydrated ghosts. At the moment, however, I was in little humor for droll fancies. I pulled at the doorknob with rising anger. That I should suddenly insist on that moment to open the cabinet only reflected the ill temper Saul's neglect could so easily create in me. I put down the sugar bowl and placed both hands on the knob. "What on earth are you doing?" I heard Saul ask from the front room. I made no answer to his question, but pulled harder on the cabinet knob. But it was as if the door were embedded solidly into the frame, and I could not loosen it the least fraction of an inch. "What were you doing?" Saul asked as I sat down. "Nothing," I said, and the matter ended. I sat eating with little if any appetite. I do not know whether I felt more anger than hurt. Perhaps it was more a sense of injury, since Saul is usually keenly sensitive to my responses. But that day he seemed not the slightest receptive, and it was that blasé dispassion in him, so different from his usual disposition, that had so thoroughly upset me. Once during the meal I glanced up at him to discover that his eyes were directed over my shoulder, focusing on something behind me. It caused a distinct chill to excite itself across my back. "What are you looking at?" I asked of him. His eyes refocused themselves on me, and the slight smile he held was erased from his lips. "Nothing," he replied. None the less, I twisted about in my chair to look, but there was only the portrait over the mantel and nothing more. "The portrait?" I asked. He made no answer, but stirred his coffee with deceptive composure. I said, "Saul, I am talking to you." His dark eyes on me were mockingly cold, as though they meant to say, "Well, so you are, but that is hardly a concern of mine, is it?" When he would not speak, I chose to attempt an alleviation of this inexplicable tension which had arisen between us. I put down my cup. "Did you sleep well?" I asked. His gaze moved up to me quickly, almost, I could not avoid the realization, almost suspiciously. "Why do you ask?" He spoke distrustingly. "Is it such an odd question?" Again he made no reply. Instead, he patted his thin lips with his napkin and pushed back his chair as though to leave. "Excuse me," he muttered, more from habit than politeness, I sensed. "Why are you being so mysterious?" I asked with genuine concern. He was on his feet, ready to move away, his face virtually blank. "I'm not," he said. "You're imagining things." I simply could not understand this sudden alteration in him, nor relate it to any equivalent cause. I stared incredulously at him as he turned away and began walking toward the hallway with short, impatient steps. He turned, left to pass through the archway, and I heard his quick feet jumping up the carpeted steps. I sat there unable to move, looking at the spot from which he had just disappeared. It was only after a long while that I turned once more to examine the portrait more carefully. There seemed nothing unusual about it. My eyes moved over the well-formed shoulders to the slender white throat, the chin, the cupid-bowed red lips, the delicately upturned nose, the frank green eyes. I had to shake my head. It was only the portrait of a woman and no more. How could this affect any man of sense? How could it affect Saul? I could not finish my coffee, but let it stand cold on the table. I rose, pushed back my chair, and started upstairs. I went directly to my brother's room and turned the knob to enter, then felt a stiffening in my body as I realized he had locked himself in. I turned away from this door, tight-lipped and thoroughly annoyed, disturbed beyond control. As I sat in my room most of the day, sporadically reading, I listened for his footsteps in the hall. I tried to reason out the situation in my mind, to resolve this alien transformation in his attitude towards me. But there seemed no resolution save that of assuming headache, imperfect sleep, or other equally dissatisfying explanations. They served not at all to decipher his uneasiness, the foreign way in which his eye regarded me, his marked disinclination to speak civilly. It was then, against my will, I must state clearly, that I began to suspect, other than ordinary causes, and to yield a momentary credence to local accounts of the house in which we lived. We had not spoken of that hand he had felt, but was it because we believed it was imagination, or because we knew it wasn't? Once during the afternoon I stood in the hallway with closed eyes, listening intently as though I meant to capture some particular sound and ferret it out. In the deep quiet I stood wavering back and forth on the floor, the very stillness ringing in my ears. I heard nothing, and The day passed with slow, lonely hours. Saul and I had a morose supper together, during which he rejected all extended conversation and multiple offers of card games and chess during the later evening. After he had finished his meal, he returned immediately to his room, and I, after washing the dishes, returned to mine and soon retired. The dream returned again, yet not in a certainty a dream. I thought lying there in the early morning, and had it not been a dream, only 100 trucks could have made such a vibration as that which shook the house in my fancy. And the light which shone beneath the door was too bright for candlelight, a glaring blue lunacy of illumination. And the footsteps I heard were very audible. Were they only in my dream, however? I could not be sure. Part 4. It was nearly 9:30 before I rose and dressed, strongly irritated that my work schedule was being thus altered by concern. I completed my toilet quickly and went out into the hall, anxious to lose myself in occupation. Then, as I looked automatically toward Saul's room, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I immediately assumed he was already up and at work above in the solarium, so I did not stop to see. Instead, I hurried downstairs to make myself a hasty breakfast, noticing as I entered the kitchen that the room was just as I had left it the night before. After a moderate breakfast, I went upstairs again and entered Saul's room. It was with some consternation that I found him still in his bed. I say on rather than in, since the blankets and sheets had been, and violently so it appeared, thrown aside, and were hanging down in twisted swirls upon the wooden floor. Saul lay on the bottom sheet, clad only in pajama trousers, his chest, shoulders, and face dewed with tiny drops of perspiration. I bent over and shook him once, but he only mumbled in sleep-ridden lethargy. I shook him again with hardening fingers, and he rolled over angrily. "Leave me alone," he spoke in thickened irritability. "You know I've been—" He stopped, as though once more he was about to speak of something he should not. "You've been what?" I inquired, feeling a rising heat of aggravation in my system. He said nothing, but lay there on his stomach, his face buried in the white pillow. I reached down and shook him again by the shoulder, this time more violently. At this, he pushed up abruptly and almost screamed at me. "Get out of here!" "Are you going to paint?" I asked, shaking nervously. He rolled on his side and squirmed a little, preparatory to sleeping again. I turned away with a harsh breath of anger. "You make your own breakfast," I said, feeling yet more fury at the senseless import of my words. As I pulled shut the door and leaving, I thought I heard Saul laughing. I went back to my room and started to work on my play, though hardly with success. My brain could not grasp concentration. All I could think of was the uncommon way in which my pleasant life had been usurped. Saul and I had always been exceptionally close to one another. Our lives had always been inseparable. Our plans were always mutual plans. Our affections invariably directed primarily upon each other. This had been so since our boyhood, when in grade school other children laughingly called us the twins, in contraction of our fuller title, the Siamese twins. And even though I had been 2 years ahead of Saul at school, we were always together, choosing our friends with regard to each other's taste and distaste, living in short with and for each other. Now this enraging schism in our relationship, this harsh severance of comradely association, is abrupt, painful transmutation from intimacy to callous inattention. The change was of such a gravity to me that almost immediately I began to look for the most grave of causes, and although the implied solution seemed at the very least tenuous, I could not help but entertain it willingly, and once more entertain, I could not remove myself from the notion. In the quiet of my room, I pondered of ghosts. Was it then possible that the house was haunted? Hastily I mulled over the invarious implications, the various intimations that the theory was verifiable. Excluding the possibility that they were dreams, there were the heaving vibrations and the weird high-pitched humming which had assailed my brain. There was the eerie blue light I had dreamed or actually seen beneath my door, and finally the most damning of evidence there was Saul's statements that he had felt a hand on his cheek, a cold, damp hand. And yet, despite all, it is difficult to admit the existence of ghosts in a coldly factual world. One's very instincts rebel at the admission of such maddening possibility. For once the initial step is made into the supernatural, there is no turning back, no knowing where the strange road leads, except that it is quite unknown and quite terrible. So actual were the premonitions I began to feel that I put aside my unused writing tablet and pen and rushed into the hall, into Saul's room, as though something were awry there. The ludicrous, unexpected sound of his snoring set me momentarily at ease. But my smile was short-lived, vanishing instantly when I saw the half-empty liquor bottle on his bedside table. The shock of it made my flesh grow cold, and the thought came, he is corrupted, although I had no knowledge of its source. As I stood there above his spread-eagled form, he groaned once and turned on his back. He had dressed, but his slept-in attire was now disheveled and crumpled. His face, I noted, was unshaven and extremely haggard, and the bloodshot gaze he directed at me was that of one stranger to another. "What do you want?" he asked in hoarse, unnatural tones. "Are you out of your mind?" I said. "What in God's name?" "Get out of here!" he said again to me, his brother. I stared at his face, and although I knew it could be only the result of drinking distorting his unshaven features, I could not dispel the apprehension that he was somehow coarse, and a shudder of strange revulsion ran through me. I was about to take the bottle away from him when he swung at me, a wildly inaccurate flinging of the arms, his sense of direction blunted by a drink-thickened brain. "I said get out of here!" he shouted in a fury, streaks of mottled red leaping onto his cheeks. I backed away, almost in fright, then turned on my heel and hurried into the hall, trembling with the shock of my brother's unnatural behavior. I stood outside his door for a long time, listening to him toss restlessly on his bed groaning, and I felt close to tears. Then without thought I descended the darkening stairway, moved across the living room and dining alcove and entered the small kitchen. There, in the black silence, I held aloft a spluttering match, and then lit the heavy candle I retrieved from the stove. My footsteps as I moved about the kitchen seemed oddly muffled, as though I were hearing them through thick cotton padding in my ears, and I began to get the most incongruous sensation that the very silence was drumming roughly in my ears. As I passed the left-hand side of the cabinet, I found myself swaying heavily, as though the dead, motionless air had suddenly become mobile and were buffeting me about. The silence was a roaring now, and suddenly I clutched out for support, and my twitching fingers knocked a dish onto the top floor. A positive shudder ran through me then, because the sound of the breaking dish had been hollow and unreal, the sound of something greatly distant. If I had not seen the porcelain fragments lying on the dark tile, I might have sworn the dish had not shattered at all. With a sense of mounting restlessness, I pushed my index fingers into my ears and twisted them around as if to ease what seemed an obstruction. Then I clenched my fist and struck the fastened cabinet door, almost desperate for the comfort of logical sound. But no matter how many strong my blows, the sound came to my ears no louder than that of someone far away knocking at some door. I turned hastily to the small icebox, very anxious now to make my sandwiches and coffee, and be out of there, up in my room once more. I put the bread on a tray, poured a cupful of the steaming black coffee, and put the coffee pot down on its burner again. Then with distinct trepidation I bent over and blew out the candle. The dining alcove and living room were oppressively dark now. My heart began to thud heavily as I moved across the rug, my footsteps muffled as I walked. I held the tray in stiff, unfeeling fingers, my gaze directed straight ahead. As I moved, my breath grew more harsh, bursting from my nostrils as I held my lips pressed tightly together lest they began shaking with fright. The blackness and the dead, utter silence seemed to crush on me like solid walls. I held my throat stiff, my every muscle suspended by will for fear that relaxation would cause me to shake without control. Halfway to the hall I heard it, a soft bubbling laughter, which seemed to permeate the room like a cloud of smoke. A swampy wave of coldness covered my body, and my footsteps halted abruptly as my legs and body stiffened. The laughter did not cease. It continued moving about me as if someone or something circled me on soundless tread, its eyes always on me. I began to tremble, and in the stillness I could hear the rattling of the cup on my tray. Then suddenly a damp cold hand pressed against my cheek. With a terrified howl of fear, I dropped the tray and ran wildly into the hall and up the stairs, my weakening legs propelling me forward in the blackness. As I ran, there was another gush of liquid laughter behind me, like a thin trail of icy air in the stillness. I locked the door to my room and hurled myself on the bed, pulling the bedspread over myself with shaking fingers. My eyes tightly shut, I lay there with heart pounding against the mattress, and in my mind the hideous cognition that all my fears were justified was a knife stabbing at delicate tissues. It was all true. As actually as if a living human hand had touched me. I had felt that cold and soggy hand on my cheek. But what living person was down there in the darkness? For a short time I belied to myself that it had been Saul's executing a cruel and vicious joke. But I knew it had not have been him, for I would have heard his footsteps, and I had heard none, either before or now. The clock was chiming 10 when I was able at last to summon the courage to throw off the spread, scrabble for the box of matches on my bedside table, and light the candle. At first the guttering light assuaged fear slightly, but then I saw how little it illuminated the silent darkness, and I avoided with a shudder the sight of huge and shapeless walls. I cursed the old house for its lack of electricity. Fear might be eased in blazing lamplight. As it was, the imperfect flickering of that tiny flame did nothing to allay my fears. I wanted to go across the hall and see if Saul were all right, but I was afraid to open my door, imagining hideous apparitions lurking there in the blackness, hearing once more in my mind the ugly, viscid laughter. I hoped that Saul was so hopelessly under alcoholic influence that nothing short of an earthquake could awaken him. And though I yearned to be near him even if he were treating me faithlessly, I felt no courage whatsoever, and quickly undressing I hastened to my bed and buried my head beneath the blankets again. Part 5. I woke suddenly, shivering and afraid. The bedclothes were gone from my body, the black silence was awful, as it had been earlier in the night. I reached for the blankets anxiously, my fingers groping for them. They had fallen from the edge of the bed. I rolled on my side hurriedly and reached down, my fingers recoiling as they came in contact with the icy floorboards. Then as I reached for the blankets, I saw the light beneath the door. It remained in sight only the fragment of a second, but I knew I had seen it, and as it passed abruptly from my eyes, the throbbing began. My room seemed filled with the humming pulsations. I could feel the bed shaking beneath me and my skin growing taut and frigid, my teeth chattering together. Then the light appeared again, and I heard the sound of bare feet and knew it was Saul walking in the night. Driven more by fear for his safety than by courage, I threw my legs over the side of the bed and padded to the door, shuddering at the iciness of the flooring beneath my soles. Slowly I opened the door, my body held tight in anticipation of what I might see. But the hall was pitch black, and I walked out and over to the door of Saul's room, listening to see if I could hear the sound of him breathing. But before I could judge anything, the hall below was suddenly illuminated with an unearthly blue glow, and I turned and rushed again instinctively to the head of the stairs and stood there clutching the old banister, staring down. Below, an aura of intense, brilliant blue light was passing through the hall, moving in the direction of the living room. My heart leaped. Saul was following it, arms ahead of him, in the familiar pose of the somnambulist, his eyes staring ahead and glittering in the shapeless blue effulgence. I tried to call his name, but found that my voice could make no utterance. I tried to move for the stairs to wrest my soul away from this terror, but a wall invisible in the blackness held me back. It grew close and airless. I struggled violently, but it was to no avail. My muscles were strengthless against a horrible, impossible power that clutched me. And suddenly, my nostrils and brains were assaulted by a pungent, sickly odor that made my senses reel. My throat and stomach burned with almost tangible fire. The darkness grew more intense. It seemed to cling to me like hot, black mud, constricting my chest so that I could hardly breathe. It was like being buried alive in a black oven, my body bound and rebound with heavy grave wrappings. I trembled, sobbing, and ineffectual. Then abruptly it all passed, and I stood there in the cold hallway soaked with perspiration, weak from my frantic efforts. I tried to move but could not, tried to remember Saul but was incapable of preventing the thought of him from slipping from my numbed brain. I shivered and turned to go back to my room, but at the first step my legs buckled, and I pitched forward heavily on the floor. The icy surface of it pressed against my flesh, and my body racked. By shivering, I lost consciousness. When my eyes opened again, I lay crumpled on the cold floor. I rose to a sitting position, the hall before my eyes wavering in alternate tides of light and darkness. My chest felt tight, and a remorseless chill gripped my body. I pulled myself up to a bent-over stance and staggered to Saul's room, a cough burning in my throat as I stumbled across the floor and against his bed. He was there and looked emaciated. He was unshaven, and the dark, wiry growth of his skin seemed like some repugnant growth. His mouth was opening and emitting sounds of exhausted slumber, and his smooth white chest rose and fell with shallow movements. He made no motion as I tugged weakly at his shoulder. I spoke his name and was shocked at the hoarse, grating sound of my own voice. I spoke it again, and he stirred with a grumble and opened one eye to look at me. "I'm sick," I muttered. "Saul, I'm sick." He rolled on one side, turning his back to me, a sob of anguish tore at my throat. "Saul!" He seemed to snap his body round insanely then, his hands clenched into bony white fists at his sides. "Get out of here!" he screamed. "Leave me alone, or I'll kill you." The body-shaking impact of his words drove me back from the bed to where I stood dumbly staring at him, breath stabbing at my throat. I saw him toss his body back over as if he wanted to break it, and I heard him mutter to himself miserably, "Why does the day have to last so long?" A spasm of coughing struck me then, and my chest aching with fiery pains, I struggled back to my own room and got into bed with the movements of an old man. I fell back onto the pillow, pulled up the blankets, then lay there shivering and helpless. There I slept all day in spasmodic periods, offset by waking moments of extreme pain. I was unable to rise to get myself food or water. All I could do was lie there shaking and weeping. I felt beaten as much by Saul's cruelty to me as by the physical suffering, and the pain in my body was extremely severe, so much so that during one seizure of coughing it was so awful I began to cry like a child, hitting the mattress with weak, ineffective fists and kicking my legs deliriously. Yet, even then I think I wept for more than the pain. I wept for my only brother who loved me not. It seemed that night came more swiftly than I had ever seen it come before. I lay alone in the darkness, praying through mute lips that no harm should come to him. I slept a while, and then abruptly I was awake, staring at the light beneath the door, hearing the high-pitched humming in my ears, and I realized in that moment that Saul still loved me, but the house had corrupted his love. And from this knowledge came resolution. From despair I gained amazing heart. I struggled to my feet and swayed there dizzily until the streaks before my eyes dispersed. Then I put on my robe and slippers, went to the door, and threw it open. What made things happen as they did I cannot say. Perhaps it was my feeling of courage that caused the black obstruction in the hall to melt before me. The house was trembling with the vibrations and the humming, yet there seemed to lessen as I moved down the hallway, and all of a sudden the blue light vanished from the living room, and I heard loud and furious rumblings there. When I entered, the room was in its usual order. A candle was burning on the mantel, but my eyes were riveted to the center of the floor. Saul stood there half naked and motionless, his body poised as though he were dancing, his eyes fastened to the portrait. I spoke his name sharply. His eyes blinked, and slowly his head turned to me. He didn't seem to comprehend my presence there, for suddenly his glance flew about the room, and he cried out in despairing tones, "Come back! Come back!" I called his name again, and he stopped looking around, but directed his gaze at me. His face was gaunt and cruelly lined in the flickering candlelight. It was the face of a lunatic. He gnashed his teeth together and started to move toward me. "I'll kill you," he muttered in liquid tones. "I'll kill you." I backed away. "Saul, you're out of your mind. You don't—" I could say no more, for he rushed at me, his hand extended as if he could clutch at my throat. I tried to step aside, but he grabbed hold of my robe and pulled me against him. We began to struggle, I begging him to throw off this terrible spell he was under, he panting and gnashing his teeth. My head was being shaken from side to side, and I saw monstrous shadows heaving on the walls. Saul's grip was not his own. I've always been stronger than he, but at that moment his hand seemed like a cold iron. I began to choke and his face blurred before my eyes. I lost balance and we both fell heavily to the floor. I felt the prickly rug against my cheek, his cold hands tightening on my throat. Then my hand came in contact with something cold and hard. It was a tray I had dropped the night before. I realized I gripped it, and realizing that he was out of his mind and meant to kill me, I picked it up and drove it across his head with all the power I had remaining. It was a heavy metal tray, and Saul sank to the floor, as if struck dead, his hand slipping from my bruised throat. I struggled up, gasping for breath, and looked at him. Blood was running from a deep gash in his forehead, where the edge of the tray had struck. Saul! I screamed, horrified at what I'd done. Frantically, I leaped up and rushed to the front door. As I flung it open, I saw a man walking by the street. I ran to the porch railing and called to him. Help! I cried. Call an ambulance. The man lurched and looked at me with startled fright. For God's sake, I beseeched him, my brother has struck his head. Please call an ambulance. For a long moment he stared at me, open-mouthed, and broke into a nervous flight up the street. I called after him, but he would not stop to listen. I was certain he would not do so as I had asked. As I turned back, I saw my bloodless face in the hall mirror, and realized with a start that I must have frightened the wits out of the man. I felt weak and afraid again. The momentary strength stopped from me. My throat was dry and raw, my stomach on edge. I was barely able to walk back to the living room on trembling stalks of legs. I tried to lift Paul to a couch, but dead weight was too much for me, and I sank to my knees beside him. My body slumped forward and half crouched, half lay by the side of my brother. The harsh sound of my breathing was the only sound I could hear. My left hand stroked Saul's hair absently, and quiet tears flowed from my eyes. I cannot say how long I had been there when the throbbing began again, as if to show me that it hadn't really gone away. I still crouched there like a dead thing, my brain almost in coma. I could feel my heart beating like some old clock in my chest, the dull-edged and muffled pendulum hitting against my ribs with a lifeless rhythm. All sound registered with similar force. The clock on the mantel, my heart, and the endless throbbing, all blending into one horrible beat that became a part of me, that became me. I could sense myself sinking deeper and deeper as a drowning man slips beneath the silent waters. Then I thought I heard a tapping of feet through the room, the rustling of skirts, and far off, a hollow laughter of women. I raised my head abruptly, my skin tightened cold. A figure in white stood in the doorway. It began to move toward me, and I rose with a strangled cry on my lips, only to collapse into darkness. Part 6. What I had seen had been not a ghost but an intern from the hospital. The man I had called in the street had apparently done what I had asked. It will give some indication of the state I was in when I revealed that I heard neither the ringing of the front door bell nor the pounding of the intern's fist on the half-open door. Indeed, had the door not been open, I am certain that I would be dead now. They took Saul to the hospital to have his head cared for. There being nothing wrong with me but nervous exhaustion, I remained in the house. I had wanted to go with Saul, but was told that the hospital was overcrowded and I would do more good by staying home in bed. I slept late the next morning, rising about 11. I went downstairs and had a substantial breakfast, then returned to my room and slept a few more hours. About 2, I had some lunch. I planned to leave the house well before darkness to make sure nothing further happened to me. I could find a room in a hotel. It was clear that we should have to desert the place regardless of whether we sold it or not. I anticipated some trouble with Saul on that point, but made up my mind to stand firm on my decision. About 5 o'clock I dressed and left my room, carrying a small bag for the night. The day was almost gone, and I hurried down the stairs, not wishing to remain in the house any longer. At the bottom of the staircase, I stepped across the entry hall and closed my hand over the doorknob. The door would not open. At first, I would not allow myself to believe this. I stood there, tugging, trying to combat the cold numbness that was spreading itself over my body. Then I dropped my bag and pulled at the knob with both hands, but to no avail. It was as securely fastened as the cabinet door in the kitchen. Suddenly I turned from the door and ran into the living room, but all the windows were jammed fast into their frames. I looked around the room, whimpering like a child, feeling unspoken hate for myself, for letting myself be trapped again. I cursed loudly, and as I did, a cold wind lifted the hat from my head and hurled it across the floor. Abruptly, I placed my shaking hands over my eyes and stood there trembling violently, afraid of what might happen any second, my heart hammering against my chest. The room seemed to chill markedly, and I heard that grotesque humming noise again that came as if from another world. It sounded like laughter to me, laughter that mocked me for my poor feeble efforts to escape. Then, with equal suddenness, I remembered Saul again, remembered that he needed me, and I pulled away my hands from my eyes and screamed aloud, "Nothing in this house can harm me!" Sudden cessation of the sound gave me added courage. If my will could successfully defy the ungodly powers of the place, then perhaps it could also destroy them. If I went upstairs, if I slept in Saul's bed, then I too would know what he had experienced and then be enabled to help him. I felt no lack of confidence in my will to resist, never once stopping to think that my idea might not be my own. Quickly, 2 steps at a time, I rushed up the stairs and into my brother's room. There I quickly removed my hat, overcoat, and suit coat, loosened my tie and collar, and sat down on the bed. Then after a moment I lay down and looked up at the darkening ceiling. I tried to keep my eyes open, but still fatigued, I soon fell asleep. It seemed only a moment before I was fully awake, my body tingling with sensations of not unpleasant character. I could not understand the strangeness of it. The darkness seemed alive. It shimmered under my gaze as I lay there warm with a heat that betokened sensualism, although there was hardly any apparent cause for such a feeling. I whispered Saul's name without thinking. Then the thought of him was taken away from my brain as if invisible fingers had plucked it away. I remember rolling over and laughing to myself, behavior most extraordinary if not unseemly for a person of my steady inclinations. The pillow felt like silk against my face, and my senses began to fade. The darkness crept over me like warm syrup, soothing my body and mind. I muttered senselessly to myself, feeling as if my muscles were sucked dry of all energy, heavy as rock and lethargic with a delicious exhaustion. Then, when I had almost slipped away, I felt another presence in the room. To my incredulous realization, it was not only familiar to me, but I had absolutely no fear of it, only an inexplicable sense of languorous expectation. Then she came to me, the girl in the portrait. I stared at the blue haze about her, for only a moment, for this quickly faded, and in my arms was a vibrantly warm body. I remember no feature of her behavior, for everything was lost in overall sensation, a sensation mixed of excitement and revulsion, a sense of hideous yet overpowering rapacity. I hung suspended in a cloud of ambivalence, my soul and body corroded with a natural desire, and in my mind and echoing on my tongue I spoke a name over and over again, the name Clarissa. How can I judge the number of sick, erotic moments I spent there with her? Sense of time completely vanished from the scheme of things. A thick giddiness enveloped me. I tried to fight it, but it was no use. I was consumed as my brother Saul had been consumed by this foul presence from the grave of night. Then, in some inconceivable fashion, we were no longer in the bed, but downstairs, whirling about in the living room, dancing wildly and closely. There was no music, only the incessant beating rhythm I had heard those nights before. Yet now it seemed like music to me as I spun about the floor, holding in my arms the ghost of a dead woman, entranced by her stunning beauty, yet at the same time repelled by my uncontrollable hunger for her. Once I closed my eyes for a second and felt a terrible coldness crawling in my stomach. When I opened them, it was gone, and I was happy once more. Happy? It seemed hardly the word now. Say rather hypnotized, torpid, my brain a numb vessel of flesh, unable to remove me one iota from this clutching spell. Dancing went on and on. The floor was filled with couples. I am sure of that, and yet I recall no aspect of their dress or form. All I remember is their faces, white and glistening, their eyes dull and lifeless, their mouths hanging open like dark, bloodless wounds. Again and around, and then a man with a large tray, standing in the hallway arch, and suddenly immersion in the dark, empty, and still. Part 7. I woke with a sense of complete exhaustion. I was soaked with perspiration, dressed only in my bottom undergarment. My clothes lay scattered across the floor, apparently thrown about in a frenzy. The bedclothes also lay in distorted heaps on the floor. From all appearances, I had gone insane the night before. The light from the window annoyed me for some reason, and quickly I shut my eyes, reluctant to believe it was morning again. I turned over onto my stomach and put my head beneath the pillow. I could still remember the enticing odor of her hair. The memory of it made my body shudder with odious craving. Then a warmth began to cover my back, and I raised myself up with a muttering frown. The sunlight was streaming through the window onto my back. With a restless movement, I pushed myself up, threw my legs over the side of the bed, and got up to draw the shades. It was a little better without the glare. I threw myself on the bed again, closed my eyes tightly, and crowded the pillow over my head. I felt the light. It sounds incredible, I know, but I felt it as surely as do certain creeper plants that climb toward the light without ever seeing it. And in feeling light, I yearned all the more for darkness. I felt like some nocturnal creature somehow forced into brightness, repelled and pained by it. I sat on the bed and looked around, a sound of unremitting complaint in my throat. I bit my lips, clenched and unclenched my hands, wanting to strike out violently at something, at anything. I found myself standing over an unlit candle, blowing sharply on it. I knew even then the senselessness of the act, and yet I did it nevertheless, trying inanely to make an invisible flame go out so that night could return through its dark roads, bringing back Clarissa. Clarissa. A clicking sound filled my throat and my body positively writhed, not in pain or pleasure, but in a combination of the two. I put my brother's robe over my body and wandered out into the silent hallway. There was no physical wants, no hunger, thirst, or other needs. I was a detached body, a comatose slave to the tyranny which had shackled me and now refused to let me go. I stood at the head of the stairway, listening intently, trying to imagine her gliding up to meet me, warm and vibrant in her mist of blue. Clarissa. I closed my eyes quickly, my teeth grated together, and for a split second I felt my body stiffen with fright. For a moment I was returned to myself. But then in another breath I was enslaved again. I stood there feeling myself a part of the house, as much a portion of it as the beams or the windows. I breathed its breath, felt its soundless heartbeat in my own. I became at one with an inanimate body, knowing its past life, sensing the dead hands that had curled their fingers on the arms of the chairs, on banisters, on doorknobs, hearing the labored tread of invisible footsteps moving through the house, the laughter of long-consumed humor. If in those moments I lost my soul, it became a part of the emptiness and stillness that surrounded me. An emptiness I could not sense, nor a stillness feel for being drugged with the formless presence of the past. I was no longer a living person. I was dead in all but those bodily functions which kept me from complete satisfaction. Quietly and without passion, the thought of killing myself drifted through my mind. It was gone in a moment, but its passage had stirred no more in me than apathetic recognition. My thoughts were on the life beyond life, and present existence was no more than a minor obstruction which I could tumble with the slightest touch of razored steel, the minutest drop of poison. I had become the master of life, for I could view its destruction with the most complete apathy. Night, night. When would it come? I heard my voice thin and hoarse crying out in the silence. Why does the day have to last so long? The words shocked me back again, for Saul had spoken them. I blinked, looked around me as if just realizing where I was. What was this terrible power over me? I tried to break its hold, but in the very effort slipped back again, to find myself once more in that strange coma which suspends the very ill in that slender portion of existence between life and death. I was hanging on a thread over the pit of everything that was hidden to me before. Now I could see and hear, and the power to cut the thread was in my hands. I could let myself hang until the strands parted, one by one, and lowered me slowly down, or I could wait until driven beyond endurance, then ended suddenly, cut myself loose and plunged down into the darkness. That signal darkness, where she and hers remained always. Then I would have her maddening warmth. Maybe it was her coldness, her comfort then. I could pass eternal moments with her and laugh at the robot world. I wondered if it would help me to get dread drunk and lose all consciousness till night. I descended the stairs on unfeeling legs and sat for a long time before the mantel looking up at her. I had no idea what time it was, nor did I care. Time was relative, even forgotten. I neither knew of it nor cared about it. Had she smiled at me then? Yes, her eyes glowed. How they glowed in the dimness. That smell again. Not pleasant, yet something excitingly musky and pungent about it. What was Saul to me? The idea filled my mind. He was no relation of mine. He was a stranger, from another society, another flesh, another life. I felt complete dispassion toward him. You hate him, said the voice in my mind. That was when it all collapsed, like a flimsy house of cards. For those words caused such a rebellion in my innermost mind that suddenly my eyes were cleared as though scales had fallen from them. I looked about, my head snapping crazily. What in God's name was I doing, still here in the house? With a shiver of angry fear, I jumped to my feet and ran upstairs to dress. As I passed the hall clock, I saw with a start that it was past 3 in the afternoon. As I dressed, normal sensations returned one by one. I felt the cold floor beneath my bare feet, became aware of hunger and thirst, heard the deep silence of the house. Everything flooded over me. I knew why Saul had wanted to die, why he loathed the day and waited for the night with such angry impatience. I could explain it to him now, and he would understand because I had been through it myself. As I ran down the stairs, I thought about the dead of Slaughterhouse, so outraged at their own inexplicable curse that they tried to drag the living down into their endless hell. Over, over exulted my mind as I locked the front door behind me and started through the misty rain to the hospital. I did not see the shadow behind me crouching on the porch. Part 8. When the woman at the hospital desk told me that Saul had been discharged 2 hours before my arrival, I was too stunned to speak. I clutched at the counter, staring at her, hearing myself tell her that she must be mistaken. My voice was hoarse, unnatural. The woman shook her head. I sagged against the counter then, all the drive gone out of me. I felt very tired and afraid. A sob broke in my throat as I turned away, and I saw people staring at me while I moved across the tile floor with unsteady motions. Everything seemed to swirl about me. I staggered, almost fell. Someone clutched my arm and asked me if I were all right. I muttered something in reply and pulled away from the person, without even noting if it were a man or a woman. I pushed out through the door and into the gray light. It was raining harder and I pulled up my coat collar. Where was he? The question burned in my mind and the answer to it came quickly, too quickly. Saul was back at the house. I felt sure of it. The idea made me start running up the dark street toward the trolley car tracks. I ran for endless blocks. All I remember is the rain driving against my face and the gray buildings floating by. There were no people in the streets and all the taxicabs were full. It was getting darker and darker. My legs almost buckled and I was thrown against a lamppost and clung to it, afraid of falling into the streaming gutter. An ugly clanking filled my ears. I looked up, then chased after the trolley car and caught at the next block. I handed the conductor $1 and had to be called back for my change. I stood hanging from a back strap, swaying back and forth with the motion of the car, my mind tormented by thoughts of Saul alone in that house of horror. The warm, stale air of the car began to make me sick to the stomach. I could smell the raincoats and the wet clothes of the people caught in the rain, as well as the smell of dripping umbrellas and packages soaked. I closed my eyes and stood there, teeth clenched, praying that I would get home before it was too late. I got off the car at last and ran up the block as fast as I could. The rain sprayed over my face and ran into my eyes, almost blinding me. I slipped and went sprawling on the sidewalk, skidding my hands and knees. I pushed up with a whine, feeling the clothes soaked against me. I kept running wildly, only sensing the direction by instinct, until I stopped and saw through the thick veil of rain the house in front of me, high and dark. It seemed to crawl over the ground toward me and clutch me to itself, for I found myself standing and shivering on the wooden porch. I coughed and felt the chill through my flesh. I tried the door. At first I could not believe it. It was still locked, and Saul had no key. I almost cried in gratitude. I ran down from the porch. Where was he then? I had to find him. I started down the path. Then, as surely as if I had been tapped on the shoulder, I whirled about and stared up at the porch. A flash of lightning illuminated the darkness, and I saw the broken, jagged-edged window. My breath caught, and I stared at it, my heart pounding like a heavy piston in my chest. He was in there. Had she come already? Was he lying upstairs in his bed smiling to himself in the blackness, waiting for her luminous self to come over and envelop him? I had to save him. Without hesitation, I ran up on the porch and unlocked the door, leaving it wide open so that we could escape. I moved across the rug and into the steps. The house was quiet. Even the storm seemed apart from it. The rushing sound of the rain seemed to grow less and less distinct. Then I turned with a gasp as the front door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. The thought drove barbs of fear into me, and I almost ran down to try to escape. But I remembered Saul, and fought to quicken resolution. I had conquered the house once, and I could do it again. I had to, for him. I started up the stairs again. Outside, the flashes of lightning was like false neon trying to invade the austerity of the house. I held onto the banister tightly, muttering beneath my breath to keep attention from degrading into fright, afraid to let the spell of the house beset me again. I reached the door to my brother's room. There I stopped. I leaned against the wall, eyes closed. What if I found him dead? I knew the sight would unnerve me. The house might defeat me then, taking me in that moment of utter despair and twisting my soul from my grip. I could not let myself conceive of it. I would not allow myself the realization that without Saul, life was empty, a meaningless travesty. He was alive. Nervously, my hands numbed with fright, I pushed open the door. The room was a Stygian cave. My throat contracted, and I took a deep breath. I clenched tight fist at my sides. Saul! I called his name softly. The thunder roared, and my voice disappeared beneath a swell. A flash of lightning brought a split second of daylight into the room, and I looked around quickly, hoping to see him. Then it was dark again and silent except for the endless rain falling on the windows and roof. I took another step across the rug, cautiously, my ears tense, trying to hear. Every sound made me start. I twitched and shuffled across the floor. Was he here? But he must be. If he were here in the house, this was the room he would be in. Saul! I called louder. Saul, answer me! I began to walk toward the bed. Then the door slammed behind me, and there was a rushing sound behind me in the darkness. I whirled to meet it. I felt his hand clamp on my arm. Saul! I cried. Lightning filled the room with hideous light, and I saw his twisted white face, the candlestick held in his right hand. Then he struck me a violent blow on the forehead, driving a wedge of agonizing pain into my brain. I felt his hand release me as I slumped to my knees, and my face brushed against his bare leg as I fell forward. The last sound I heard before my mind fell into the darkness was laughing and laughing and laughing. Part 9. I opened my eyes. I was still lying on the rug. Outside it was raining even harder. The sound of it was like the crashing of a waterfall. Thunder still rolled in the sky, and flashes of lightning made the night brilliant. In one flash, I looked at the bed. The sight of the covers and sheets all thrown about insanely made me push up. Saul was downstairs with her. I tried to get to my feet, but the pain in my head drove me back to my knees. I shook my head feebly, running trembling hands over my cheeks, feeling the gouged wound in my forehead, the dried blood which had trickled down across one temple. I swayed back and forth on my knees, moaning. I seemed to be back in that void again, struggling to regain a hold on my life. The power of the house surrounded me, the power which I knew was her power, a cruel and malignant vitality, which tried to drink out the life force from me and draw me down into the pit. Then, once more, I remembered Saul, my brother, and the remembrance brought me back the strength I needed. No! I cried out as if the house had told me. I was now its helpless captive, and I pushed to my feet, ignoring the dizziness, stumbling through a cloud of pain, across the floor, gasping for breath. The house was throbbing and humming, filled with that obnoxious smell. I ran drunkenly for the door, found myself running into the bed. I drew back with almost a snarl at the numbing pain in my shins. I turned in the direction of the door and ran again. I did not even hold my arms ahead of me, and had no chance to brace myself when I ran into the door dizzily. The excruciating pain of my nose being nearly broken caused a howl of agony to pass my lips. Blood immediately began gushing down my mouth, and I had to keep wiping it away. I jerked open the door and ran into the hall, feeling myself on the border of insanity. The hot blood kept running down across my chin, and I felt it dripping and soaking into my coat. My hat had fallen off, but I still wore my raincoat over my suit. I was too bereft of perception to notice that nothing held me back at the head of the stairs. I half ran, half slid down the stairs, goaded on by that humming, formless laughter, which was music and mockery. The pain in my head was terrible. Every downward step made it feel as if someone drove a nail into my brain. "Saul! Saul!" I cried out, running into the living room, gagging as I tried to call his name a third time. The living room was dark, permeated with that sickly odor. It made my head reel, but I kept moving. It seemed to thicken as I moved for the kitchen. I ran to the small room and leaned against the door, almost unable to breathe, pinpoints of light spinning before my eyes. Then as lightning illuminated the room, I saw the left cupboard door wide open, and inside a large bowl filled with what looked like flour. As I stared at it, tears rolled down my cheeks, and my tongue felt like dry cloth in my mouth. I backed out of the kitchen, choking for breath, feeling as if my strength were almost gone. I turned and ran into the living room, still looking for my brother. Then in another flash of lightning, I looked at her portrait. It was different, and the difference froze me to the spot. Her face was no longer beautiful. Whether it was shadow that did it or actual change, her expression was one of vicious cruelty. The eyes glittered. There was an insane cast to her smile. Even her hands, once folded in repose, now seemed more like clawed, waiting to strike out and kill. It was when I backed away from her that I stumbled and fell over the body of my brother. I pushed up to my knees and stared down into the blackness. One flash of lightning after another showed me his white, dead face, the smile of hideous knowledge on his lips, the look of insane joy in his wide-open eyes. My mouth fell open and breath caught in me. It seemed as if my world was ending. I could not believe it was true. I clutched at my hair and whimpered, almost believing that in a moment Mother would wake me from my nightmare, and I would look across at Saul's bed, smile at his innocent sleep, and lie down again secure with the memory of his dark care on the white pillow. But it did not end. The rain slapped presently at the windows, and thunder drove deafening fists against the earth. I looked up at the portrait. I felt as dead as my brother. I did not hesitate. Calmly, I stood and walked to the mantel. There were matches there. I picked up the box. Instantly she divined my thoughts, for the box was torn from my fingers and hurled against the wall. I dove for it and was tripped by some invisible force. Those cold hands clutched at my throat. I felt no fright, but tore them away with a snarl and drove for the matches again. Blood began running faster, and I spat out some. I picked up the box. It was torn away again, this time to burst and spray matches all over the rug. A great hum of anguish seemed to rock the house as I reached for a match. I was grabbed. I tore loose. I fell to my knees and slapped at the rug in the darkness as lightning ceased. My arms were held tightly. Something cold and wet ran around in my stomach. With maniacal fury, I pressed my teeth against the match. I saw the lightning and bit at the head. There was no rewarding flare. The house was trembling violently now, and I heard rustlings about me as if she had called them all to frighten me, to save their cursed existence. I bit at another match. A white face stared at me from the rug, and I spat blood at it. It disappeared. I tore one arm loose and grabbed a match. I jerked myself to the mantel and dragged the match across the rough wood. A speck of flame flared up in my finger, and I was released. The throbbing seemed more violent now, but I knew it was helpless against flame. I protected the flame with my hand, though lest that cold wind come again and try to blow it out. I held the match against the magazine that was lying on a chair, and it flared up. I shook it, and the pages puffed into flame. I threw it down on the rug. I went around in that light, striking one match after another, avoiding the sight of Saul lying there. She had destroyed him. Now I would destroy her forever. I ignited the curtains. I started the rug to smoldering. I set fire to the furniture. The house rocked, and a whistling sigh rose and ebbed like the wind. At last, I stood erect in the flaming room, my eyes riveted on the portrait. I walked slowly towards it. She knew my intention, for the house rocked even harder, and a shrieking began that seemed to come from the walls. And I knew then that the house was controlled by her, and that her power was in that portrait. I drew it down from the wall. It shook in my very hands as if it were alive. With a shudder of repugnance, I threw it on the flames. I almost fell while the floor shuddered, as if an earthquake were striking the land, but then it stopped, and the portrait was burning, and the last effect of her was gone. I was alone in an old burning house. I did not want anyone to know about my brother. I did not want anyone to see his face like that. So I lifted him and put him on the couch. I do not understand to this day how I could lift him up when I felt so weak. It was his strength, not my own. I sat at his feet, stroking his hand until the flames grew too hot. Then I rose. I bent over and kissed him on the lips for a last goodbye. And I walked from the house into the rain. And I never came back, because there was nothing to ever come back for. This is the end of the manuscript. There seems no adequate evidence to describe the events recounted as true, but the following facts taken from the city's police files might prove of interest. In 1901, the city was severely shocked by the most wholesome murder ever perpetrated in its history. At the height of a party being held at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Marlin Slaughter and their daughter Clarissa, an unknown person poisoned the punch by placing a very large amount of arsenic in it. Everyone died. The case was never solved, although various theories were put forth as to its solution. One thesis had it that the murderer was one of those who died. As to the identity of this murderer, the position had it that it was not a murder, but a murderess. Although nothing definite exists to go by, there are several testimonies which refer to that poor child Clarissa, and indicate that the young woman had been suffering for some years from a severe mental aberration, which her parents had tried to keep a secret from the neighbors and the authorities. The party in mention was supposed to have been planned to celebrate what her parents took for the recovery of her faculties. As to the body of the young man later supposed to be in the wreckage, a thorough search has revealed nothing. It may be that the entire story is imagination, fabricated by the one brother in order to conceal the death of the other, said death probably being unnatural. Thus the older brother, knowing the story of the house tragedy, may have used it for fantastic evidence in his favor. Whatever the truth, the older brother has never been heard of again, either in this city or in any of the adjacent localities. And that is the story. S.D.M.